Okay, welcome everyone to another virtual seminar hosted by CEGO. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Raymond, I'm sorry, how do you say it again?
Najjar.
Najjar, okay, sorry. I just
Okay.
really want to say it right, Najjar. So anyway, pleased to introduce. And before we get into the actual talk, I just want to let everyone know that we're going to be keeping our webcams off and we're going to stay muted. And if you have any questions that come up while you are watching and listening to our talk, you can just message them directly to me. And at the end, I'll be facilitating the Q&A session. So if anybody has questions throughout about other things, you can also message that to me. So anyway, our guest speaker, Dr. Raymond Najjar, obtained a B in mechanical engineering at Cooper Union for the advancement of art and science, and now holds a PhD in atmospheric and ocean science from Princeton, and which is close to home for me. So that's interesting to me. And he did a postdoc with the National Center for Atmospheric Research as well, and now is a professor of oceanography at Penn State. And his early work focused on large-scale open ocean biogeochemistry. And since then, he's become interested in coastal issues such as eutrophication, hypoxia, and sea level rise, which are all strongly connected to anthropogenic climate change. So with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Robert, and thanks to those of you that arranged my visit, including George. I really appreciate it. Of course, I only regret that I can't be there in person. So thanks for joining me. I know that these, another Zoom event is not a whole lot of motivation to come to. So I appreciate it in these difficult times. And I just feel like we've all got important work to do. We've just got to keep our heads down, keep at it, and we'll get through it. And we'll all be better for it. Society will all be better for the work we do to make the world a better place, make coasts healthier, oceans healthier, and all that. So we forge on. Well, I'm really pleased to talk to you today about some carbon cycle work I've done in coastal waters over the past couple of years. I've focused a lot on my work has been focused a lot on Chesapeake Bay, a little bit of Delaware Bay, and then some sort of synthesis work regionally along the East Coast, including the Mid-Atlantic Bight, where I've had a number of projects. And more recently, I've gotten involved with some global efforts, which I'm really pleased about because I really enjoy doing work that's at a large scale and that has implications globally. That's sort of, as Robert pointed out, that's where I started out my early work in kind of global biogeochemistry, focused on phosphorus cycling and air sea oxygen flux and other things. So yeah, if there's any questions that come up for clarity, I guess your protocol is to pass them on to Robert. And I normally take questions during the talk if they come up, but I'll follow your structure in case anything is unclear.
I'll try to interject in a useful way if any of the questions that come up are pertaining to what's on the slide.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Well, this is my first time also using the closed captioning, and I hope that goes well. I think I should be maybe talking a little bit more deliberately and perhaps a little more slowly, I suppose, to make it more coherent. I want to start off with some motivation about why the carbon cycle is important. There are a lot of reasons for studying carbon cycling. Of course, one of them is that carbon dioxide is an important greenhouse gas. And we often forget, I think, or at least I forgot, and I occasionally remember when I have to teach about it, that carbon dioxide is a super important greenhouse gas. Sometimes you hear it downplayed from climate skeptics who argue correctly that water vapor contributes more to the greenhouse effect than carbon dioxide does, at least on a individual watt per meter squared basis per gas. But carbon dioxide is unique because is different from water vapor because it's not condensable. It has a very long lifetime in the atmosphere. And therefore, water vapor is really a slave to what carbon dioxide does. And I want to show you this figure from a very nice paper um, out of the NASA modeling group at GISS, the Goddard Institute for Space Studies. And what they did was they took a climate model and they suddenly removed carbon dioxide from it. And what you see, what happens here, here's time on the horizontal axis. There's a lot of things plotted here. So let's just briefly go through them one at a time. So as a greenhouse gas, of course, if you remove carbon dioxide, the temperature will start to drop. But as soon as the temperature starts to drop, lots of other things happen shortly after that. The amount of water vapor in the atmosphere starts to go down. And that's a greenhouse gas as well. And so that will add to even more cooling and contribute to more of a temperature drop. And perhaps somewhat paradoxically, cloud cover goes up. And that might surprise you if the water vapor goes down, but it goes up because you can reach saturation more quickly. So now you have cloud cover going up. Sea ice also starts to go up as well. And both of those contribute to an increase in the reflectivity of the planet, the albedo. And that, of course, causes temperature to drop more, water vapor to drop more. And of course, this is a positive feedback that's occurring, a kind of vicious cycle that occurs. And the amount of cooling that you get is really quite remarkable. It goes from the mean temperature of about 14 or 15 degrees Celsius down to minus 20 degrees Celsius. And that's what we expect actually from a kind of radiative balance 101 calculation of the greenhouse effect. It's about 30 or 35 degrees Celsius. In other words, if the planet had no atmosphere, it would be about 30 degrees colder as a result. So it's really, CO2 is really quite remarkable. We think about it mostly in terms of the anthropogenic and enhanced greenhouse effect, but it really has this a first order role in maintaining the temperature of the planet. Of course, carbon dioxide is important because it leads to acidification of the ocean. And here's some time series from subtropical areas showing how the pH in the ocean has declined over the past 20 or 30 years quite systematically. And it's declining in a way exactly expected from the invasion of anthropogenic CO2. And of course, that has impacts on the ability, for example, of calcifying organisms to make their tests and shells, and lots of other impacts on ocean chemistry and biology. The carbon cycle is also important because carbon dioxide stimulates plant growth, and not just for plants on land, but it affects how tidal wetlands grow. It affects how seagrass grows. It even affects some plankton species, stimulates their growth because it's an essential nutrient. And of course, there's many other reasons for studying the carbon cycle. It's responsible for rock weathering on our planet. Carbon is the main currency by which we quantify the productivity of the biosphere, including how productive fisheries are and how productive our agricultural system is, how productive our forests are. So it's really a first order phenomenon that we need to understand as earth scientists. So in the traditional view of the carbon cycle, at least the one that involves anthropogenic carbon dioxide, the land and the open ocean are not connected. We normally think of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere from fossil fuel burning and from deforestation. And then that carbon dioxide, about half of it is residing in the atmosphere. And then about the remaining 50% is roughly evenly split into uptake by the land and uptake by the ocean. So there's this kind of, we think of them almost as silos. There's CO2 going into the atmosphere, then being removed on land, and being removed in the ocean. But this view ignores a very active natural carbon cycle that's being perturbed, that takes carbon that's taken up by land naturally. So terrestrial systems are essentially net autotrophic. They're removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Of course, they release a lot of that as respiration, but a significant fraction eventually gets into rivers, right? Gets into soils and then groundwater and then rivers. Some of that is buried in riverine sediments. Some of it is outgassed by rivers and lakes, right? All of these inland waters. A fair bit of carbon, roughly about a petagram of carbon per year. That's a lot of carbon, right? That's about half the carbon dioxide taken up by the ocean, for example. Anthropogenic carbon dioxide taken up by the ocean. There's about a petagram that makes its way into estuaries, and they're combined here with tidal wetlands. We'll be pulling them apart later. And of course, there's a lot of processing that goes on in this system, burial, exchange with the atmosphere. This carbon eventually makes it out into continental shelf waters where there's further interaction with the atmosphere and burial, and finally making it into the open ocean where there's some burial, but a fair bit of outgassing as well. And there's this whole loop here, natural loop that's been perturbed, that is processing carbon, and that needs to be accounted for when you make anthropogenic carbon budgets and you're trying to understand how the carbon cycle is changing. So that's this, some have called it this river loop, this flux of carbon from the land into the ocean as a natural outgassing of land. I haven't closed the loop here, but then there's uptake on land again. So it's important in global carbon budgets, but the constraints on it are not great. And this number developed by Andy Jacobson, which was a big advance at the time, and others about 10 or 15 years ago, they estimated that this loop is about a half a petagram of carbon per year of natural outgassing from the ocean. And they just took estimates of the carbon flux at the head of tide, essentially, and at the time, and then made estimates of how much carbon was buried in the ocean. And then, of course, by mass balance, the residual has to be outgassed. And one would expect this at steady state, the same amount, about a half a petagram of carbon, to be taken up by land. This is what we call like a single pipe view, because it ignores so much of the processing that goes on in this sort of ocean part of what we call the land-ocean aquatic continuum, which includes inland waters, reservoirs, rivers, tidal wetlands, estuaries, coastal waters, right? It's ignoring a lot of the processing that's going on particularly in nearshore waters and estuaries and tidal wetlands. And yet, I think it's because it's sort of the best that's available. It's used in global budgeting exercises by the Global Carbon Project, which was the figure I showed you earlier from the anthropogenic CO2 budget is from the Global Carbon Project. And they sort of adjust their numbers to account for this natural river loop. And, you need to know this natural outgassing, because one of the, from an oceanographic perspective, one of the ways we've got constraints on how much anthropogenic CO2 is taken up by the ocean is by measuring the partial pressure of CO2 throughout the surface ocean, taking the difference between that and the atmospheric partial pressure, converting that to a flux, and then calculating a global flux. Now, that's an uptake by the ocean, but if you really want the uptake of anthropogenic carbon, you have to subtract off this natural outgassing, okay? And that's in this estimate, about a half a petagram of carbon. That's a lot of carbon, because we're talking about when we do these calculations, we get about 1.5, maybe 2 petagrams of carbon of net uptake. And so we've got to add a half to that. We're basically adding 30%, 25% to that number to get the anthropogenic CO2 uptake. So it's an important number. And a recent study by Laura Resplondi and Ralph Keeling and others used interhemispheric transport carbon estimates within the ocean as a constraint on this river loop. Because as it turns out, a lot of the carbon comes into the ocean in the northern hemisphere and is transported. It's really remarkable. So the loop actually transports carbon across the equator into the southern hemisphere, where there's a lot of ocean, not many rivers, and a good deal of the outgassing comes out there. So there's also an interhemispheric transport of carbon that's wrapped up in this river loop. And Laura and others used estimates of interhemispheric transport to put further constraints on the river loop. And they came up with a significantly larger number of about 0.8 petagrams of carbon per year. But really no mechanism as to how does one arrive at that 0.8? We have a pretty good idea of how much carbon is coming in from rivers to tidal wetlands and to estuaries, but all the processing that occurs in between is really poorly constrained. So that's where I come in. Really, coastal waters are an important part of this land-ocean aquatic continuum. There's a lot of processing, as many of you know, as many of you are coastal marine scientists, and you know how active the biogeochemistry is in the coastal zone. Globally, the area is small, but the rates are really high. And so there's good reason to believe there's a lot going on there that we need to take into account. We need to understand the processes in that zone, let's say from the head of tide, right? The fall line, whatever you want to call it, maybe out to the shelf break, right? That's the kind of coastal part of this continuum. So we think it's important, but yet we really lack detailed carbon budgets that include the sort of main subsystems of coastal waters, which I break up into tidal wetlands, as 3 distinct kind of subsystems. It would be tidal wetlands, estuaries, and continental shelf waters. Okay, and so this is how I would show it in a cartoon form. These things, starting with land here on the left and open ocean here on the right. We've got these 3 zones that are connected to each other, and I'll be using some of this terminology, U for uptake of carbon dioxide by these systems from the atmosphere. Now, of course, estuaries actually they're net outgassing, so this U here would be negative for estuaries. So there's exchange with the atmosphere. There's burial of carbon. I'll use the symbol B for burial in all of these systems. There's lateral transport. Rivers carry carbon really directly into estuaries, sort of alongside the tidal wetlands. That's why I've have it here as a dashed line. Tidal wetlands, going back to Odom and others, there's this outwelling hypothesis that carbon is being transferred from tidal wetlands into estuaries by tidal pumping. Some carbon is exchanged directly with shelf waters for the more coastal salt marshes. There's, of course, riverine delivery directly into estuaries. There's a lateral transport from the mouth of the estuary into shelf waters, and then there's a lateral transport from shelf waters to the open ocean. So there's a lot of fluxes to account for, and also there's internal processing of carbon. There's transformation of carbon by net ecosystem production, which is net primary production minus heterotrophic respiration, right? That will take inorganic carbon and convert it to organic carbon. And of course, in some systems, like estuaries, for example, tend to be net heterotrophic. So they're really more, they're respiring more than they are photosynthesizing. So that's additional transformations that are important to account for. So that gets to the sort of first part of this talk. I've broken it up into kind of a regional perspective and then a global perspective. And in the first part of the talk, I'll be focusing on Eastern North America, which is really mostly the East Coast of the United States as we have depicted it. And our goal in this part of the study was to construct a carbon budget for coastal waters of Eastern North America. We really hadn't had any carbon budgets for any region of the world that included these three main domains. Maybe for an individual estuary, we've had such a budget, maybe for an individual tidal wetland, but nothing that really connected all of the different subsystems. And there are a lot of, a carbon budget can answer a lot of research questions for you. And I pose a few of them here, which is, really simple kind of first order questions. How much carbon is actually fixed in the region? What's the metabolic poise of the whole region? Is it net autotrophic, net consumer of carbon dioxide, or is it net heterotrophic, a net producer of carbon dioxide? That's a different question than whether the region is a source or sink of atmospheric CO2, because the fate of CO2 isn't necessarily exchanged with the atmosphere. It could be lateral transport as well. And then finally, how much carbon is buried in the region? That's important if we really want to know what the long-term sequestration capacity is of a region. So that's what we set out to do in this paper, which was published in 2018. You can see it has a lot of co-authors. We're spanning a large area. We're spanning these multiple subsystems. So it really requires a lot of different expertise. So that's why we have so many people to help us out. In this project, I forgot to acknowledge the funding agency. A lot of this work was funded by NASA because we used a fair bit of remote sensing in certain aspects of the project. A second paper where we made an improvement in estuarine burial was led by Jack Hutchings, who was a student of Tom Bianchi's. And he substantially improved our estimation of burial in estuarine sediments. In this paper, we used an empirical model that was based on nitrogen budget to quantify the estuarine burial. And Jack Hutchings actually got quite a different answer here. This is, I think, a much more reliable estimate, much more data-based than our empirical modeling estimate. I want to pause here because and I want to acknowledge Mike Kemp, who was a collaborator on this project, and I've been doing work in Chesapeake Bay for quite a while, and read many of Mike's papers, and was a big fan of his work. I finally got to meet him when we worked together on the Science and Technical Advisory Committee for the Chesapeake Bay program, maybe 15 years ago. And then I was really fortunate to have him as a collaborator on this project here. And you can see his co-author on this paper. And we co-authored a couple of papers together. Well, as maybe some of you know, Mike recently passed away after battling Parkinson's disease for several years, and I just wanted to acknowledge him. He was a great scientist, but I guess I'm sorry, I didn't really mean to be breaking up like this. But I do want to acknowledge him, not only as a great scientist, but also just incredibly generous and gracious colleague. And I really learned a lot from him, not only in terms of science, the nuts and bolts of science, but also how to be a great collaborator, and how to work with people and inspire them, make the most of working together. It was really a joy to work with, and he's going to be sorely missed. I'm really upset about it because he just retired, but he was still active. He still had so much to give, and it's really sad to see him go. Okay, so on with the first part of this project. This is our study domain. So we're including tidal wetlands, which you actually can't see on this graph because there's such a fringing system, but they only make up 2 or 3% of the total area. The estuaries, you can see they're in this dark shading here. They make up about 10% of the area. And then shelf waters make up about 90% of the area here. And we have these three subdomains, the Gulf of Maine, which has most of the shelf area, the Mid-Atlantic Bight, which has most of the estuarine area, and the South Atlantic Bight, which has most of the tidal wetland area. So it's really cool how these three subdomains kind of are different in terms of their emphasis on the different ecosystems that they include. So here's a kind of zoomed in picture of one of the estuaries that we made a budget for. We use this NOAA segmentation estuarine ecosystem assessment, NEEA. And they basically break up the United States into 100 or 200 major estuaries, and they connect each estuary to a watershed, and they provide a whole lot of kind of metadata on each estuary. And this is one of the systems in the South Atlantic Bight, one of the 50 or so systems along the East Coast. And we also exploited the NWI's database for tidal wetlands, and Audra Hinson and Rusty Fagan did a lot of work on this sort of tidal wetland part of the project. So you can see our subdomains of sub ecosystems here. We've got the rivers coming in here at the head of tide. This is tidal fresh marsh transitioning into salt marsh. You can see the open waters of the estuary here and the shelf waters there. So I'm not going to go into details of the methods of how we constructed this budget. It's sort of a long-term kind of steady state budget. It's kind of a mile wide and an inch deep. Honestly, it's a lot of synthesis of different information. So in some cases, we just compiled historical data. For example, it's very nice burial synthesis paper by Ouyang and Lee, and we just took the burial estimates from that for this paper. In some cases, and this is where Mike Kemp really helped out, we developed statistical models. For example, in some of his early work from the 80s and 90s, he found that estuarine net ecosystem production could be understood as a function of the riverine delivery of inorganic nitrogen and organic carbon, right? The DIN favoring net autotrophy and the TOC favoring net heterotrophy. And then we also had access to numerical models. For example, Margie Friedrichs, who's a colleague of mine at VIMS, has a 3D biogeochemical model of shelf waters, and we used results from that as well. And then we also made the assumption of steady state mass balance. And many of these fluxes are very difficult to measure directly. One of them is, for example, the lateral flux, advective flux from estuaries to shelf waters. We just computed that as a residual term in the mass balance. So here are the results. This is the total carbon budget for coastal waters of the eastern U.S. And I'll start off with showing the net uptake here. We found that tidal wetlands took up about 5 teragrams of carbon per year. Estuaries outgassed about 4, and shelf waters took up about 4. The burial here is, and this is where Jack contributed a lot, because this number increased by like a factor of 4, Jack Hutchings. We have burial in all of the systems is significant, but about half of it takes place in estuaries, and the remaining 50% is split between shelf waters and tidal wetlands. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. The tidal wetlands, are basically a tiny fraction of the shelf water area, and yet bury just as much carbon. And then our lateral fluxes here, we have a lot of carbon coming in from rivers, right, delivered directly to estuaries. There's a large transfer of carbon from tidal wetlands into estuaries. It's equal to about half of the carbon delivery from rivers themselves. So estuaries are getting about a third of their carbon from upland sources directly from tidal wetlands. So that was for us, that was a big surprise that the tidal wetlands contribute so much to the estuarine carbon budget. And there's a small amount of carbon exchange between tidal wetlands and shelf waters. And these are the lateral fluxes computed as a residual here. And you can see those lateral fluxes are important as well. So the bottom line here is that the total carbon budget indicates, all three ecosystems are important, as are the transfers between them. There's really no kind of negligible numbers here. Each and every flux is quite significant. So I want to drill in now a little bit and look at how much carbon is fixed in each system. This is the carbon, the net primary production per unit area. Per unit area. I've been ignoring the chat. Am I supposed to be paying attention to this? Let's see. Oh no. Okay.
No, it's okay. I'm watching.
All right. Yeah. Kind of going into teaching mode there for a second. So you can see the net primary production per unit area is a lot higher in tidal wetlands than it is in estuaries and shelf waters. But of course, the shelf water area is so much larger, so that when you spatially integrate the NPP, the shelf really dominates. This shows the fraction of the net primary production that is net ecosystem production, or the NEP over the NPP, right? So this sort of measures how autotrophic or heterotrophic the systems are. And you can see that the tidal wetlands and shelf waters here are net autotrophic, whereas estuaries are net heterotrophic. I forgot to point out the color scheme here. This is not the Gulf of Mexico. This is the Gulf of Maine. Is in green. The Mid-Atlantic Bight is in blue, and the South Atlantic Bight is in orange here. So you can see how each subdomain is doing as well. Now I'm going to look at the carbon budgets. Now we didn't do just a total carbon budget. We did organic carbon budgets and inorganic carbon budgets. So I'm going to drill down now and look at the tidal wetland budgets, both in terms of organic carbon and inorganic carbon. I'm going to be showing, I'm using the same symbology that I showed before. NEP is net ecosystem production, B is burial, L always means a lateral flux from something to something. So this is from tidal wetlands. This is the loss of carbon by lateral transport into the estuary. So you can see that all terms are important. The lateral transport, burial, and in the case of the inorganic carbon budget, uptake from the atmosphere. And you see that the South Atlantic Bight and the Mid-Atlantic Bight dominate the study domain. That's where most of the wetlands are. The SAB in particular stands out as dominant because of its high, relatively high area. Here are the estuarine budgets, and again, net ecosystem production, burial. This is lateral transfer from the wetlands to estuaries, lateral transfer from estuaries to shelf waters. This is the riverine input, and so forth for both organic carbon and inorganic carbon. And we find out, now I should say that I haven't updated this figure with Jack's burial numbers here. So the burial should be quite a bit higher, 4 times higher, probably even larger than the net ecosystem production. And that would reduce the lateral flux from estuaries to shelf waters, maybe maybe cut it in half. So this figure does need some revision, and we're working on that with a follow-up paper. And so you can see that the estuarine budgets are dominated by riverine input and the lateral fluxes, as well as the outgassing. And the South Atlantic Bight and Mid-Atlantic Bight really dominate the study domain. And that's, again, where a lot of the estuaries are. Very few estuaries and the very low estuarine area in the Gulf of Maine. Then finally, here are the shelf water budgets. And we see that they're really dominated by a balance between net ecosystem production. They're net autotrophic, the shelf waters, right? So they're producing organic carbon, and then they're exporting it out into open ocean waters, right? And they're importing much of their inorganic carbon from the open ocean, and that's being used to fuel a good bit of the net ecosystem production. Okay, so we can answer some of our research questions that we posed before. How much carbon is fixed in the region? It's about 150 teragrams of carbon. What's the metabolic poise? The ratio tilts towards net ecosystem, positive net ecosystem production. It's about 10% of the net primary production. How much carbon does the region bury? About 4 teragrams of carbon. And is the region a source or sink of atmospheric CO2? It's a sink of about 5 teragrams of carbon per year. So it's a summarized or overarching finding is that the coastal carbon budgets should explicitly consider tidal wetlands, estuaries, shelf waters, and the linkages between them. Ignoring any one of the ecosystems might produce a biased picture of coastal carbon cycling. And the interesting thing is, I should have pointed this out when I showed the budget figure. But despite all the processing that's occurring, there's a lot of exchange with the atmosphere. There's a fair bit of burial when you compare those numbers to what's coming in rivers, right? So there's a lot that happens between the head of tide and the shelf break. But despite that, the fluxes at those 2 points are just about the same, 7 or 8 teragrams of carbon per year. And the reason is there's net uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere of order 5 teragrams of carbon. And then there's a similar amount of burial that's taking place. So, so you're left with, in terms of total carbon anyway, about the same carbon coming into the system, at the head of tide, than is leaving the system at the shelf break. Now, the quality of that carbon is certainly different, and more of it is a greater fraction of it is organic, because the whole metabolic poise of the system is net autotrophic. So you've converted some of the inorganic carbon to organic carbon. Okay, so there we go with the first part of the talk, and let me just check my time here. Let's see, I should end, like within 10 minutes. Yeah.
I think it's okay to go over a little bit. I'm not in a rush at any rate.
Okay.
But yeah, about 10 minutes is probably where we should aim.
Yeah. So this is a lot more recent work. And I think it's actually appropriate that I go through this quickly. But it's an effort to look at this sort of part of the land ocean aquatic continuum at the global scale. Now, it's not really the first time it's been done, but we're doing it in a lot more detail than it has been done before. And the driving question goes back to this river loop that I introduced earlier. What's the fate of riverine carbon when it reaches tidal waters? And can we improve upon the Jacobson-All estimate of this river loop that is about a half a petagram of carbon that's outgassed? So that's the main objective of the talk, to quantify with error estimates the river loop as well as its anthropogenic perturbation. Because, as it turns out, some of the anthropogenic carbon that's in the ocean didn't get there through the atmosphere. And not all the anthropogenic carbon taken up on land is actually being stored there. It's gotten put into this whole land-ocean aquatic continuum. So like my regional carbon budget, we're doing a bottom-up approach. It's really a lot of it is literature synthesis, and we do use this approach of mass balance and estimate some fluxes from mass balance where we don't have direct estimates. And this is work that's really being led by Pierre Renier and Laura Splandi and Philippe CA have also contributed to it. So this is a manuscript that we're working on right now. And this is the summary figure here. I'm just giving you the final result. It shows the present day carbon budget now in petagrams of carbon per year. So these numbers are about 100 times larger than the ones I showed you for the East Coast. And you see some features that are similar to what we saw earlier. Namely that these fluxes, these exchanges with the atmosphere and these burial fluxes, when you add them up, they're of the same order as the riverine input. So they contribute significantly to the carbon budget. The amount of outwelling of carbon from tidal wetlands into estuaries is fractionally less than what we had along the East Coast. Along the East Coast, it was about a half. This flux here was about half of the riverine flux, and here it's more like, what is it? More like an eighth. But the errors, the errors are large, and of course, part of the reason why the errors in tidal wetlands are large because we don't really have a good handle on what the total salt marsh area or tidal marsh area is in the world. We have a pretty good estimate on mangrove area, but not the marshes. So that's one thing. These fluxes are significant, but again, we see this kind of intransigence, if you want, of this lateral flux, right? What's coming in from rivers into estuaries is about the same as what's going from estuaries to shelf waters, about a petagram of carbon per year. And that in turn is about the same as what's going from the open ocean, from the shelf waters to the open ocean. So some similarities there between the East Coast, US East Coast budget and the global budget. So we also made an effort to, and it's very difficult, and a lot of it is, is sort of expert opinion, which means a little bit of guesswork about how those fluxes have been perturbed. So we know we have, we use data from the modern day to constrain the fluxes, and then we try to estimate. For example, we know that tidal wetland area has been reduced. And so that means some of the fluxes in the past associated with tidal wetlands are probably a lot larger, right? They were burying more carbon, they were exporting more carbon laterally. So we do those sort of things, and we use models sometime to quantify the perturbation and then get an estimate of the pre-industrial carbon budget for coastal waters. So you can see these numbers, they're not dramatically different. I'm flipping back and forth. You can see the riverine transport is lower in the past, estimated to be lower in the past than it is today, although maybe not significantly so when you account for the error. And we see the same feature where what's going out into the open ocean is pretty similar to what's coming in at the head of tide. And we not only, I've been focusing kind of on this area here, estuaries, tidal wetlands, continental shelf waters, but we also made estimates for the fluxes here in inland waters, which can be quite large, as well as some of these weathering fluxes as well, and included the open ocean in the budget. Again, just building on literature values here. And so here's the full global pre-industrial carbon budget. You can see that there's a lot of carbon being taken up on land naturally, almost 2 petagrams of carbon taken up by terrestrial ecosystems. A lot of that is outgassed, and a good fraction of it is basically transported ultimately to the open ocean. Some of this carbon that reaches the open ocean, however, is like what we call a shorter range loop here, where this carbon taken up by continental shelf waters and tidal wetlands in particular that transfers carbon there. So what we end up with is a number of Andy's number here, Andy Jacobson's number here was 0.6. I mean, was point. Okay, maybe I should just focus on this number. This is really the number of concern. How much is outgassed naturally? So we estimate it to be 0.65 petagrams of carbon per year, and the error is as high as 50% on that number. Yeah, that's all I want to say about that. So to conclude here, regional and coastal carbon budgets in coastal waters reveal that there's a lot of processing between the river mouth, by that I mean the head of tide and the shelf break. However, the net lateral flux changes modestly as a result of compensating exchanges with the atmosphere and sediments. In other words, there's as much buried as there is taken up from the atmosphere. And then this sort of bottom-up analysis that we did quantifies the pre-industrial river loop to be 0.65 plus or minus is the 2 sigma errors, 0.3 petagrams of carbon per year. I think that's all I have. And thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate you taking some of your lunch hour there to listen to me, and I hope you found this interesting. And of course, I'm looking forward to your questions. And in particular, since we're working on this paper for the pre-industrial river loop, we would welcome comments on that. Pierre has encouraged me to ask for feedback about that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Najjar. So I could actually put up my own slide for the captioning if you want to be able to see us all more easily.
Sure. So I should stop sharing here, right?
Yeah, and I'll share my own. Oh, I accidentally opened MATLAB, of course. 1 second. Hope you guys aren't seeing MATLAB right now. All right, there we go. Where's my slideshow? Okay, test. There we go. So first of all, thank you very much. This was a very insightful talk. And I did want to mention something about Mike Kemp. So I think that the last year has been really tough for the scientific community in general. I can think of a couple people that have passed away since like 2019 who are really instrumental in the scientific community and in the scientific culture overall. But I think it's a really positive thing about what we do that we can remember people through their work and their influence on the culture.
Agreed. Yeah.
I'm glad that you brought it up. Okay, so maybe we could start in with one of our questions. I've already gotten a few. The first one is from Gail. I think her family name is Shimura. You can always correct me. I like to say people's names right. And she was asking about the map. There was a map that you showed with the Bay of Fundy, but it was mentioned that only the U.S. East Coast was chosen to represent North America. Were the Fundy wetlands and estuaries included in the study?
Let's see. I don't think so. We do pull a little bit. We do a Gulf of Maine budget, and so we trying to think now exactly what rivers we included and estuaries we included for the Canadian part of the Gulf of Maine. We had to do some extrapolation there to scale up what we found in the US part of the Gulf of Maine to the Canadian part of the Gulf of Maine. And I can't remember if the Bay of Fundy, it doesn't ring a bell to me that those tidal wetlands were included in the Gulf of Maine budget. Does that system empty into the Gulf of Maine?
Gail updated me and said Fundy is part of the Gulf of Maine. So I guess it's possible, even though it shares a political border with Canada.
Okay, yeah, I'll look into that. I didn't think that I don't think we included it directly, but I could just be not remembering um, the results from our 2018 paper. I'll check and get back to you. Thanks for asking the question.
Okay. So the next one is from George Shui. I think it's Shui. I'm having a tricky time today. So the question is, with pre-industrial conditions, how would you confine the low temperature, low sea level tide range, and lower air PCO2?
You're gonna have to try that again on me.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question either. So George, if you want to unmute and explain, I think that would maybe be more helpful than me trying to interpret.
I agree. Yeah. Can you hear
Hi,
me?
George.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. Good talk. Yeah. My question is like, you say you are working on a paper about the pre-industrial condition, but in that estimation, how will you estimate this? Like, for example, the air PCO2 at that time, the relatively low water temperature, the sea level was not that high at that time, and
Right.
or is this from like a global model or?
No. I think we chose to leave the air water estuarine CO2 flux alone because there were so many competing factors that could drive it in different directions. We published a paper recently about Chesapeake Bay addressing that issue exactly, like how has the carbon cycle changed in Chesapeake Bay, say from the early 1900s to the early 2000s. And there were a lot of offsetting factors, right? The nutrient delivery was a lot different, for example. And so, and that I think worked against, for example, the change in atmospheric CO2. And there were also changes associated with temperature, as you pointed out, as well as changes in the riverine delivery of DIC and alkalinity. And, what we found from that study, as I said, that there's a lot of offsetting effects. And we don't have that kind of modeling study that we've done for the whole world. So that was something that we didn't change, but we added an error to our calculation for all of that.
Okay. The next question and comment is from Xinping He.
Hi, Ping. Yeah, nice to hear from you.
They say greetings from Texas, and they send their condolences about Mike. Yeah. And their question is, how much does the global synthesis include estuaries with little or no riverine input, but perhaps more groundwater influence in semi-arid or arid regions?
So we took the synthesis from Govan Laruelle, which is similar to Chen's synthesis from 2013. So what we're doing here is we're really updating Pierre Regnier's 2013 paper, where he articulated the land-ocean aquatic continuum and made estimates for all of these fluxes, but he didn't have access at that time. Govan's paper and Chen's paper weren't published or didn't make it into his manuscript. So we included that. So geez, how many systems there? The answer is I don't know. Maybe you know if it's Govan's or the Chen et al. Synthesis. Do you have a sense, if you're aware of those 2013 syntheses, do you know if they included these sort of systems?
Well, I have to find out. I'm not really familiar with this study though.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ray.
Including those, do you think would it? I mean, do they tend to be to be kind of above average or below average, say, in terms of their outgassing?
I think it depends on the wind speed, because here in Texas, wind speed really high, and we find the CO2 degassing is kind of greater than some of the East Coast estuaries, even though the PCO2 there is much higher.
I see. Okay. So their PCO2s tend to be lower than average, but the wind speeds could
Yeah.
could compensate.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, this next question is from Eugene Turner, and it's regarding the Clean Water Act. So this Clean Water Act led to changes in pH on the East Coast as a result of smokestack releases and other controls. And this changed the alkalinity and weathering. And he wants to know if you have some idea about how these regulations change the carbon budget for rivers.
Yeah. Well, in the Delaware, for example, I've looked at, I did a study about oxygen in the Delaware, and you know, the oxygen values were, you know, incredibly low in the tidal fresh part of the system before the Clean Water Act, and the pHs were really low, which means I haven't done the calculation. Something I've wanted to do, but the PCO2s, you know, would have been a lot higher, and the pH has gone up, right? My pH has gone up quite a bit in the upper part of the Delaware. So the outgassing has to be lower. But you know, it depends on the ratio of organic loading to inorganic loading. So in that case, you know, the Delaware's hypoxia problems were because of this, you know, huge amount of organic, you know, it was like literally a sewer, huge amount of organic matter being dumped in there. But there might be systems that were where the shift was really in the organic nitrogen loading, and that would drive things in the opposite direction. Those are some of the things that we found from the Chesapeake study when we tried to model this effect, where the changes there have been mostly in the inorganic nitrogen loading. So so I think it can go both ways, and it's hard to say what the global impact would be, or even the regional impact along the East Coast. Although of course we weren't trying to do it do the anthropogenic perturbation on the East Coast. We're just looking at the modern carbon budget.
Okay, so George Shui has a follow-up question. I think he says, are those based on global results? I think he might be asking about your final figure, where you had an updated set of fluxes.
Yeah, that's a global. That's the work in preparation with Pierre Renier and others.
Okay. Chris Delia has a question. It's permanent burial of carbon in the sediments is a critical factor in the global carbon budget. And since strong storms have great impact on sediments and coastal waters, to what extent do storms impact your budgets?
Yeah, I mean, they're not taken into account directly. I mean, I can say that we did account for what we think, as I pointed out earlier, how tidal wetland area has changed, and some of that could be as a result of storms and other things, although probably most of it is land use change. The burial estimates that we did in that we used for the East Coast in tidal wetlands were basically combination. You know, it's based on the work by Ouyang and Lee, and you know, which was sort of an update to Gail Chamorro's work, where they take cores and sedimentation rates, organic carbon content and sedimentation rates and things like that to calculate the burial rate. So you know, I don't know to what extent those cores are influenced by storms. Maybe they're not. Maybe you're self-selecting for cores that aren't really altered. In terms of the estuaries, we did a similar thing there. Although in that case, what Jack did was he calculated the from the core top total organic carbon and near surface sedimentation rate, calculated a deposition flux, and then used a model, which is based on sedimentation rate, to calculate, what the burial efficiency was, what fraction of the deposited carbon is buried. So, I don't know, to what extent those calculations are influenced by storms. What do you think?
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to add anything. I think it might be very difficult to actually trace like what the impact of storms would be and isolate it from other effects, since it's just like a very dynamic process by which we get the sediment deposition. But that's just my personal opinion. I'm not very keenly aware of all of it. So here's another question from this one's from Mike Lagua. Have you explored the ways that would increase the capacity of some of the carbon sinks in the system you described, like insight on how to increase burial potential?
No, I haven't. I mean, I would just cite the sort of obvious things about, wetland restoration and that sort of thing. So it's not an area I'm very, very familiar with.
Junhong Liang is asking, what are some of the major uncertainties in the estuary and the shelf carbon budgets, respectively?
For the East Coast, I would say the exchange rate with the atmosphere. It varies a lot seasonally and spatially throughout the estuary. So it's difficult. To monitor a given system for exchange with the atmosphere, a given estuarine system, and to quantify it is really tough. And the problem is we don't have, most studies in estuaries. I mean, Xinping has done a lot of work along these lines, and has some of the best estimates for individual estuaries of the fluxes, and he knows how much work is involved with that in terms of sampling to cover seasons, to cover different parts of the estuary, because the upper parts of the estuary tend to be much more heterotrophic than the lower part. So you need spatial variability, then there's interannual variability as well. So it can be really, really challenging to do that. And then for the East Coast, we had 53 systems. And of course, we weren't able to get estimates for all of those. So we had to just extrapolate. So I think that's a big uncertainty. And that's why in a recent paper in the Chesapeake, we went back and used some of the historical pH measurements and sort of, so there in the Chesapeake Bay program, you have like 30 years of pH measurements up and down the whole estuary and all the tributaries. And, these measurements aren't of the highest quality, but you have a lot of them. And they may be able to beat down the error. That's what we found. We could beat down the error by exploiting the historical pH measurements if we had some modern measurements to sort of provide independent estimates. So that may be one way to tackle this problem of uncertainty in the air water estuarine flux, is to exploit some of the older historical water quality data.
Chris D'Elia just mentioned that he has pH measurements from the 1930s. If you're interested, you could probably get in touch.
Yeah, that would be great. And what system?
I think he's implying Chesapeake. So Chris, feel free to let us know.
Yeah, it's Chesapeake. It's mostly from the Patuxent River. These are old records that we found in the attic at Chesapeake Biological Lab years ago, and obviously they're old pH readings, so they're not going to be as good as they would be now.
Wow.
But I do have them if they're used, and there were also some measurements from the 60s in various power plant studies that are probably available.
Wow, that's really interesting. I know there was an old, we recently published on alkalinity in the Chesapeake Bay, and that's another sort of relatively common water quality variable. And Chinping has also done, he's exploited some of the Texas sort of water quality alkalinity data to look at long-term trends. And we did something similar in the Chesapeake. And, so that goes back to the mid 80s. But what I also found in that work was that there was a really old study in the Patuxent on alkalinity. And I wonder if it's from the same group. Chris,
Who was the author?
Do you know who the author is?
I'm not sure who it was.
Yeah.
I'm sure I have the record somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'll follow up about that. Thanks for pointing that out. Appreciate it.
They're in my office here in Louisiana, so
Okay.
I have to dig around and find them. But
Right.
I'd also ask you, did you follow the work of Steve Smith and Tim Hollabaugh, who did a lot of alkalinity work in Tamales Bay and the West Coast, looking at net heterotrophy and things like that?
Yeah. Well, we at the end of that paper, that alkalinity paper, which was really a lot of fun to write, we did a kind of a comparison to the literature, because we, from the alkalinity, I mean, what we found with the alkalinity in the Chesapeake is really interesting. So it was mostly data in the tidal tributaries. There's a handful of tidal tributaries along the sort of western shore, and some of the tribs are alkalinity sources. There's alkalinity being produced within the system, or maybe outwelled from a sulfate reduction in infringing tidal wetlands, right? And some of them, like in the Potomac, there's a spectacular alkalinity sink, and we think it might be due to an invasive clam, the corbicula. But I bring that up because then at the end of the paper, we did a comparison to other alkalinity studies, and that was one of the best ones in Tamales Bay, where they do this sort of box modeling to back out. I mean, I think if I recall correctly, they have an alkalinity source there from sulfate reduction, if I'm remembering that correctly. So yeah, I have looked at that and as a point of comparison with the Chesapeake work.
If I could, I'll comment a little bit on Mike Kemp. He was a former colleague of mine, and I'm glad you mentioned him. I was at University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science for 20-something years, and this is during the beginning of the Chesapeake Bay programs. And Mike Kemp and Walt Boynton and I and others worked together quite a lot on that really wonderful program that helped to develop a lot of the comprehensive knowledge that we have about the Bay right now. And Mike was a very large figure in all that, and I think most everybody in our group is aware of, that does anything with estuaries, is aware of his work and knew him. I have only seen him periodically, mostly at national meetings over the last few years, but it's been a very sad decline to see him getting less and less mobile. And he had a very bad 6 months that everything fell apart. And I suppose it's good that he passed finally, because things were so miserable for him. But it's a big loss for our community, and I appreciate you mentioning him. I also noticed that there was in today's Science magazine, there was a memorial piece to Joe Connell, who was a really well-known intertidal invertebrate guy, and he was an incredible experimental scientist. So we've had some big losses this year.
Yeah,
it's appropriate to remember them.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Really appreciate it.
Okay, I think we have one last question from Yuriko Dasa. First of all, a nice overview of the carbon fluxes and budgets. But his question is, given the uncertainties of some of the budget and fluxes, what improvements could we foresee in the future? Maybe what are we striving for?
Yeah, well, I think one of the big ones is tidal wetland area. I mean, the marsh area. Yeah, I mean, if we don't know we don't know the marsh area globally. So, I mean, even it's really amazing. Even in papers just a couple of years ago, it might even still be used. The way we would estimate global marsh area for people that were so bold to do it would be they would take it came out of a paper by George Woodwell in the 1970s, and what he did, and I don't blame him at all for doing it because you gotta start somewhere, but at that time the tidal wetland area in the U.S. was reasonably well known, so that was known, and then he just scaled that globally given the coastline length, right? We know the coastline length in the US and globally, and just scaled it up. Well, that number I bet that paper is still cited as an estimate for global tidal wetland area. And there was a recent study by McCowan that more mapping was done and was improved, but still we've got a ways to go. So that to me sticks out as one of the most important things to quantify. Even estuarine area, I feel like we don't necessarily have a good handle on.
Maybe this is naive of me to say, but I imagine it must be very difficult to get like a very high precision coastline length, because it's basically like the edge of a fractal, right? You're trying to take an integral of something that's ridiculous,
right,
to even comprehend. But
yeah,
that's a pretty cool approach.
Well, it was done for mangroves. I mean, I think it's incredibly tedious work. You're looking at Landsat images and things like that, and it's been done for mangroves, and I think we feel pretty confident about the global mangrove area, and I think just a similar type of approach needs to be taken for marshes, for tidal marshes.
Is there an estimate right now of what the fraction of total marshes is that is like mangroves, or like what the ratio is?
Yeah. It's I mean, depending on what your estimate is of the tidal wetland area, the mangrove estimate is significantly higher than the current estimate of marsh area. So I forget what the factor is, a factor of 2 or something like that.
But much higher.
Yeah. But it's pretty clear that the tidal marsh area is an underestimate, right? I mean, so how high it could be is not really clear.
Interesting. All right. Well, thank you again for giving us this talk, and hopefully we'll be seeing you around in the future.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. Really appreciate it. Everyone, take care, be well, and hope to see you at maybe at the surf meeting in November, a year from now.
Thank you again. Really great talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah. Thank you again. Take care.
Bye now.